ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Amy. I am super excited to be able to offer a presentation tonight. As you guys probably saw in our introduction, my background comes from working under Dr. Hilary Cash and for a company called Restart Life in Washington. I worked for both their residential treatment center for adolescents about 13 to 18 years old, and I also worked with their young adult program that served youth about 18 to 35. And all of it was centered on problematic technology use. So I joke with people, I worked in tech rehab. So because of that, I have a pretty good background of how to acknowledge technology is a very real part of our life, both good and bad. And I'm really excited to just kind of offer a whole training to everybody because I get asked questions about technology pretty much daily. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start screen sharing. I've created a PowerPoint we're going to go through that'll help us kind of stay on track for this presentation. And like Amy said, if there's questions as we go along, we're going to go ahead and answer them in this chat box here at the very bottom. And we look forward to getting started. So go ahead and give me 1 second while I get my screen started. Okay. Can everybody see this all right? All right. So just really quick, I know Amy kind of covered a lot of this really well. We are going to provide time for questions at the end. Please try ahead and try to keep yourself muted. We will have an email at the end of this presentation for myself, for Amy, and for Jason Carls here at Eastside. You can always email any additional questions that you think of to any one of us. And then we are also offering a short survey in the comments box. We're asking everybody, please do complete that because we would like to continue offering future trainings and presentations, and your feedback helps us figure out how to do that. And then here at the very bottom, because we are doing this over a Zoom Ring Central, we're just asking for a little bit of patience with some of those potential technology hiccups. So like, for example, the office I am in right now has an automatic light here in the back. So if my screen just goes dark, all that's happened is my light can't see me. So I'll just wave my hand all funny and then it'll see me again. So just to kind of get everything started, one of the first and most valuable things I think I learned while working at Restart Life was a pretty deep understanding of what goes into building the different technology systems. So what we're going to see here is an example. We're going to use Facebook because just about everybody understands Facebook. And if you can start to kind of understand the larger systems, whether that's social media, whether that's video games, whether that's YouTube, you can start to understand a little bit better why your kid presents as being like obsessed with this kind of stuff and just not able to let it go. So what we're looking at here is how creators, coders, what the back end of Facebook's going to look like. So when companies are creating their platforms or their games, they use two different things. One are going to be called black core drives, and that's what you're seeing here: scarcity, avoidance, unpredictability. The reason that we are driven psychologically to do things is based out of being obsessed, having anxiety, or some kind of addiction. So in the case of Facebook, if we look at this avoidance, for example, you see right here down here, scarlet letter. So Facebook is very calculated using that you don't want to avoid it because then you're worried that you're going to kind of carry a scarlet letter around and everybody goes, oh, you don't use Facebook. Unpredictability is another really important thing Facebook uses. It'll cause you anxiety because it's always, I don't know what I'm going to see. I don't know what I'm going to see. Think about right here, this refreshing content. Every time I log on Facebook, it's going to be different. So that scrolling feature that Facebook and Instagram uses was a very calculated move that they made to get people to spend more time on the platform because it's always unpredictable what the next thing you're going to scroll through and see. The other thing that they're going to use are called white core drives. So those are these three up here. White core drives psychologically push us to do things from a sense of power, fulfillment, satisfaction. So again, if we go back to the example of Facebook, empowerment might be like, I can share whatever I want. I can find all these different groups. I have this instant feedback from friends liking me. I can feel really accomplished when I'm getting a lot of likes and comments. So these two factors, and you see these two here in the middle that kind of lean a little bit on both. So social pressure, you know, this kind of like, well, everybody's doing it. And if I get invites from my friends, I need to be part of that. And then this ownership piece kind of hits on both those black and white core drives that you get to build your own profile. It's very tailored to just you. So if we think about Facebook, it on the surface seems like we're just posting pictures and chatting with friends, but Facebook as a company has put a lot more thought and effort into how they're creating the game and the platform and whatever else they want to show you. So when they started coming out with videos, that was a very calculated move to drive you from those white and those black core drives. And the whole reason is money. So the biggest thing that you just got to remember is that for a lot of these large tech companies, they don't view you, they don't view your children as people, they view you as data points. And they're really just emphasizing, how can I make more money? So understanding this was a really powerful thing that helped me start to understand and then start managing and treating some of the kids I worked with and how they interacted with technology. In fact, even just having this kind of conversation with some of the kids really opened their eyes, and they said, well, I don't want to be owned by Facebook. I don't want to use that. So that would kind of be where we're going to start tonight, is just a little bit of background and understanding. The other really important thing I learned out of working at Restart was how technology kind of impacts and interacts with your brain. So I really like this picture right here because it kind of talks about all the different factors that drive our brains into a state of what we call hyperarousal. Most people understand this as fight or flight. You might be saying, well, when I sit on the couch, you know, I don't feel like I'm in fight or flight. I'm just kind of scrolling through my phone. And the truth is, it's probably not a very large fight or flight, but the way the patterns in your brain work do match up with that. And we'll give you an example. I'm sitting here and I have my phone next to me. Let's say I get a text message come in. I hear ding, I hear a buzz. Already, I'm having some sensory stimulation. It's hitting at least 2, and as soon as I look at it, 3 of my 5 senses. I am always going to hit those reward and addiction pathways as soon as I hear the ding for my phone or I feel the buzz. That starts that activation of that pathway. As soon as I look at my phone or I say, oh, what's that? That finishes that reward and addiction pathway. It is no different if I was to be playing a slot machine when I either pull the lever or I press a button and it starts the slots going. That is all reward addiction pathways happening in the brain. Bright and blue toned light is another thing that can cause our brains to go into a state of hyperarousal. And the reason this goes back to that we have evolved to be in nature. Our eyes and our brain are geared to look at reds, greens, browns, warm tones from the sun. When we spend a lot of time in front of bright and blue toned light, think like fluorescent lighting. If anybody ever gets headaches from fluorescent lighting, a lot of that is because it's just very, very unnatural. So your brain's having to work almost overtime to compensate and understand it.
Hey, quiet, buddy.
We can also think about this idea of media multitasking and interactivity and rapid pace. So if I go back to the text message example, let's say I'm in the middle of doing an email, but I hear my text message. So I stop my email, I go to my phone, I answer my text, I go back to my email. After I write my email, maybe there's another text. So already you can see how I'm kind of going back and forth, and there's that interactivity and rapid pace. These two things will really drive your brain into a state of hyperarousal because it's not sure if you're worried or if you're trying to do fight or flight. Your brain doesn't quite understand that you're just media multitasking, but the rapid pace and the flipping back and forth can make your brain really question what's going on. I'm not going to speak too much to the electromagnetic radiation because I don't understand it very well. I understand these 5 a little bit better. But if you'd like to learn more about it, let me know after a presentation, and I can try to find a little bit more research for you on that. The other things that I learned, and honestly I saw firsthand in treating a lot of the youth who came through our center, was things like developmental impacts on growing brains actually do have some visible structural changes that will happen. So there was a study that was recently completed in 2019 that looked at the brains of youth under MRI. So pretty much live scanning of what's going on. And what they found was that the more time these youth spent in front of a screen, the less growth they had in both their white matter and gray matter of their brains. Now, truthfully, we're still kind of trying to figure out exactly what white matter and gray matter do. They think white matter is kind of like the working part of the brain, gray matter not as much. But even just being able to see physical structural changes directly related to screen use was a little concerning, because there's almost a myth that spending a lot of time playing games or things like that is maybe going to make your kids smarter. Or faster at things. And while this might be kind of true, what this particular study found was that these youth actually had a harder time both processing as well as retaining information. And they think it's just related to those structural differences and changes that they saw. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how this matters when you're working with younger children. But just to remember that the younger a child is, honestly, less technology is better, because it will impact the development of their brain. Another example, just from my personal experience, is I would say a majority of the youth who came through our center who I treated would tell me pretty consistently that they started playing video games anywhere from the age of 7 all the way down to the age of about 3. And when I say playing video games, I don't necessarily mean get on for an hour and play with friends. I mean all day, every day in front of the screen. And what we saw with a lot of these kids is that their age might be 16, but you felt like you were talking to somebody who was about 11. And we had a lot of conversations as staff that the time that you seriously start using a lot of technology, generally time tends to be the time that the development would start to be stunted. And we would see very rapid development while they were in our center, because we limited very strongly the amount of technology they were allowed access to. Another thing we saw all the time was a lowered ability to read nonverbal conversation. So for example, like crossing my arms, making facial expressions, tapping my foot. All these might relate to how I'm feeling or how I'm approaching the situation. But what we saw all the time is a lot of kids who were spending plenty of time in front of a tech lived from their heads up. They were very disconnected from their bodies, to the point that they weren't taking showers for months on end. They didn't even know when they had pain in their body, because they were just very oriented in everything that was going on with their head. What we have also learned about human psychology is that empathy towards ourselves and towards other living things is based in the ability to read nonverbals. So often when kids would first come to our center and they were going through their detox period around technology, they were pretty grumpy. They were not very fun to be around. And they didn't really recognize a lot of nonverbal signals happening from the staff and from their fellow residents there at the center. When they had spent some time with us, when they had detoxed, when they got some knowledge and did things like spend time in nature and exercise that encouraged them to learn their body, learn the signals of those around them, they started to have a lot more empathy for themselves, for those around them, for their families. So that's just a really another important thing I learned. We also saw all the time that technology is very instant gratification. So if I want to know what the weather is, I don't even have to go outside. I just pick my phone up and within 5 seconds, I know what the weather's like. But what we would also see is that this created an incredibly low tolerance for boredom. I mean, like, these poor kids couldn't even sit for a couple minutes without feeling like they had to do something. Or they would want an answer right now because they were so used to getting that from their Alexa, from their Siri. One of the best examples I have for this is we had a couple bald eagles that nested on the property that we could see with binoculars. It was super cool. And the kids had questions for me all the time about the eagles. We also had a full set of encyclopedia in the library that they had access to. But almost none of them were willing to go and take the time to go to the encyclopedia, to open it to the E, and to read about eagles. But instead, they would come to me and they would go, well, how long do eagles nest? And what do they eat for dinner? And all these other questions, because they didn't have the tolerance to go through and look and actually read the information. Their brains have been wired for the instant gratification of the answer that just comes to you. And then the last thing that we would see a lot is this big increase of dopamine and serotonin productions among reward pathways. Dopamine being the neurochemical that's created in your brain. Most people associate it as like the happy chemical. And serotonin is generally known as a mood stabilizer, and it also has a lot to do with memory. So essentially what would be happening with the kids who would be coming to our center, by and large, they wouldn't really be using a lot of drugs. They wouldn't really be using alcohol very much or nicotine, but they would be highly addicted to the own dopamine that they would create in those reward pathways along their brain. So we can think that there's essentially two kinds of addictions. There's chemical addictions that are based, those are the ones we're really common with. You know, it is something chemical outside us that causes us to have an addiction. The other thing that we see that's starting to get a lot more known is what we call a process addiction. So these might be technology, exercise, sex, food. We get addicted to the process of what's happening. The challenge is our brains kind of don't know the difference, and the pathways are not any different within the brain. So the closest pathway, or I guess connection between technology and anything else out there would be cocaine. So when we look at somebody's brain who uses a lot of cocaine, and we look at somebody's brain who uses a lot of technology, the reward pathways do look pretty similar for how they're primed, how fast they work, and how challenging it is to readjust the brain to not put everything that they have down those pathways. So when youth would come to our center, this was kind of a handout we would give them, and we would ask them to run through these 10 items. So preoccupation, feeling restless, maybe attempts to quit have failed, using to escape or feel better. If anybody's ever had any interaction with an addiction in their life, this might look pretty similar. If you replace digital media with alcohol, if you replace use with, drugs, it's honestly in a lot of ways no different. And so what we would start to talk to them about is, has tech really disrupted one or more areas of your life? And if that's the case, then it probably is problematic. And this is where it gets a little challenging, and the comparison between technology and other addictions doesn't quite work. If I have a youth and they're drinking a lot, I can tell them, hey, let's work on stopping drinking and get it out of your life and just don't do it anymore. I can't come to a youth and say, let's stop using your computer, let's stop using technology, because it's so baked into part of our lives these days that it's not fair to also say you can't do it. So I am always very clear when I'm having these presentations and when I introduce kids to our center that I am not anti-tech. I'm going to play on my phone after tonight too. However, I am going to make an argument that we use our technology a lot more mindfully and that we balance our technology with other things in our life. So at this point, you might be asking, oh my gosh, now what? I might have scared you a lot about all the horrible things that technology can do. So let's go ahead and go through kind of different ages and maybe in a kind of a perfect world scenario, what you might want to do. So when we look at tech use in kids 0 to 5 or maybe pre-K, we always want to be asking why. It goes back to what we were talking about the impacts that can happen in the brain. We really want to ask, why am I giving this child a piece of technology? Why am I putting this movie on? If the answer is, I'm tired, it's the end of the day, I have a Zoom meeting I have to get onto, and it's just easier, then that's okay. But you've still taken the time to ask why and to balance it out and be really mindful about how that thing might impact your child's brain. If at all possible, try to use educational tech. There was a question that had come in prior to this presentation about, well, are there some recommendations or are there some examples of educational tech? The first and foremost I will always tell people is PBS. PBS has some really good educational materials out there. Watching TV is considered one of the more benign ways that we can interact with technology because it really only uses 2 of your senses. It doesn't involve as many of your senses as, say, playing a video game does. So if you're going to give your younger child technology, maybe try to put on a movie, maybe try to find an educational program that they could watch, and work with your school on this too. Generally, a lot of educators have some pretty good recommendations for educational ways that kids can engage with technology, whether that's a YouTube video, whether that's a game they can play. But educational tech is at least going to help foster more well-rounded brain development as opposed to, and there's nothing wrong with just kind of a fun movie here and there. But especially with this age, always be mindful of why you're giving your kid tech. As much as you can, try to really limit use and balance it with a lot of non-tech things like toys, nature time, play. Toddlers, babies, and as they start getting older, but especially those ages, really need a lot of face-to-face contact and a lot of nonverbals because that's how they start to learn how to read their world. And unfortunately, what we're seeing more and more of these days, especially with younger and younger kids, is that they have a very hard time reading nonverbals. There's even something called acquired autism that's starting to be seen a lot more in therapeutic circles, where a kid will present with what seems like autism because they don't really want to talk, they don't really want to make eye contact, they have a very hard time reading social skills in the room. However, what happens is when you remove technology from these kids' lives, what had seemed like autism kind of just goes away. So the best that they can figure is what's happening is these kids are not getting any of the input for their brain of how to read social situations. Instead, all they're learning how to do is use the technology. So when you play with your kid, like please just play with your kid. And I completely understand that this is not always practical for all parents, but I'm just going to encourage you guys, if you want to raise a healthy, sustainable tech using well-rounded child, it starts with just toys, play, nature time when they're young. The other really important thing is being able to model sustainable tech use, because this is an age that is highly susceptible to what the adults in their lives are doing. That's actually why I picked this cartoon of, he texted his first word today. Well, he's probably kind of trying to watch what the adults are doing. So if you as a parent are willing to model sustainable tech use, or do your best to not use your technology around your child and instead engage with your child, then they themselves will be less likely to bug you about tech, less likely to always want tech. One of the easiest recommendations I make to families is to balance tech time with nature time, and especially at this age. So if you are going to watch a movie for an hour, try to go outside down to the park for an hour or around the block for a walk. Not always completely practical to go one-to-one, but try your best to balance it out. The other recommendation that I make all the time is, as a parent, you really have to resist FOMO, or fear of missing out. So that was the other reason I picked this cartoon, is because these two adults are talking to each other and they're saying, he texted his first word today. So one adult might really be feeling this like, well, my kid hasn't texted yet. Am I falling behind? Is my kid not going to be successful in life? There's a very strong push right now to kind of go keep up with the Joneses when it comes to technology. And it's the hardest thing to resist fear of missing out, but it is the most helpful thing you can do for yourself, for your family, for your child, is be willing to be different. Set yourself aside and say, these are the boundaries that we need for our house so we can raise healthy children for the world. When we start to move into tech use in the 5 through 11 kind of elementary school ages, again, we're going to go back to this idea of balancing tech time with nature time, really doing a lot of play, trying to introduce a lot of creativity, reading, writing, drawing, and boredom. I dealt with this all the time at our treatment center, where parents would tell me, but my kid's telling me I'm so bored. That's okay. Your child actually needs to learn how to be bored, because there's going to be lots of situations in life that are pretty boring. And if they don't learn how to sit with that, then they don't learn how to work through those situations. and they'll always kind of try to be numbing the boredom with something else. So if your kid comes to you and says, I'm just so bored, you can say, okay, be bored. It's not a bad thing. And in fact, there's some pretty interesting emerging research that's happening that says states of boredom are directly related to creativity and to imagination. So if you're concerned about your child being bored, remember that you're actually helping them foster creativity, imagination, a willingness to think outside the box. And that's a pretty important life skill that doesn't come from a whole lot else. Elementary school is also a really good age to start having conversations about sustainable technology use. Broaden it, encourage the child, well, why are we using this? And again, really be willing to be different. It is okay to be different from your neighbors, from others in your community, and you can always talk to your child, well, this is how we in our house are using technology. Usually this is the age where children start to bug for their own device, or maybe grandma and grandpa want to get them something for Christmas, like their own tablet. Really kind of explore thoroughly the pros and cons of getting your child your own device. It's not necessarily a bad thing. If it's going to help them be more successful, they've earned it, that's awesome. But really weigh the pros and cons before just handing your child a piece of technology. The other thing that you can do is you can set up some pretty clear tech boundaries to begin to be followed as very much a living document. And we're going to have a really good example of this later in the presentation. So the reason I say make it a living document is because a lot of kids are worried, well, if we set boundaries around tech, it's never going to change, and I'm never going to get to use technology. But if they know that, maybe between summer and school, or, at the beginning of the year, whatever was going to work for you and your family, that we're going to talk about it. We might adjust this tech boundary, the easier time they'll have following it. So some things that you can include in a tech boundary would be creating some tech-free zones. Like most people are familiar with, don't let your kid have phones or anything at bedtime, or maybe no with meal times. I also like to make the recommendation, try to make the car a tech-free time. So much easier said than done. I definitely acknowledge that. And if you're going to be doing a really long road trip, obviously it's probably going to be easier if you can put a movie in, if you can let them play on their phones for a little while. But the reason I emphasize tech-free zones in the car is a twofold. First of all, the car is actually a really cool place. You can have a lot of conversations with your kid, and I've had some of the deepest therapeutic conversations with my kids in cars. Something about going somewhere, driving, seeing things, they're just a lot more willing to talk. So there can be some really beneficial conversations you can have out of car time. The other reason I suggest, especially at this age, try to make your car a zone, a tech-free zone, is because when they get to the age that they are ready to start getting their driver's license and things like that, they've already had a lot of years of being practiced with, I don't use my phone in the car. So they're hopefully a lot less likely to text or to talk or to do whatever they do on their phones while they're trying to drive somewhere. Another important feature would be to discuss technology at your friends' houses in the community. I worked with more than one youth whose parents had put every last restriction possible on technology within their own house. So the kid learned pretty quickly, well, I'm just going to go to my friend's house. My friend let me play this game. It's totally fine. Or I'm just going to go down to the library and use the library's computers. I can play my game there. So obviously, you don't get to control everything that's outside of your house. However, you can start having the conversation. This is how I would like tech to be used at your friend's house, and maybe work with the other parents. Decide what works for both of you guys. Talk about how we use technology sustainably and healthy in the community. The computers at the library are really to help people do research and to look books up. Yes, you can play games on them, and maybe I'll let you for a little while. But, the rules that apply in our house can still apply to some community spaces and to some extent when they go to their friends' houses too. A technology boundary is also a really good way to start structuring some kind of positive and negative consequences for use. So most often this looks like, if you can use it well, I'll give you more tech time. If you can't use it well, I'm going to take some tech time away. Where it gets hard to say this is what you should or shouldn't do is every single family is different. So for one kid, Maybe the positive negative consequences of taking away or getting more tech time work great. For another kid, they might not work at all. So the positive and negative consequences around healthy, sustainable tech use might need to be completely different. And that comes down to you, your family, and whatever you decide is a good tech boundary for yourself. When we move into middle school and kind of the 11 to 15 age, you can go ahead and build on a tech plan that you already started, continuing to really ask why and start updating the boundaries as age appropriate. Maybe in elementary school, there's some rules that you don't have your phone while you're here at school, but maybe that rule changes when you come to middle school. So now is a really good opportunity to update the tech plan that you've already started and make those boundaries a little more age appropriate. So yeah, maybe you can have your phone. You know, there's this meme over here where the kids are actually using their tech to take notes. So maybe that is an okay use of it. Continue to really just explore how you can balance tech time with nature, with that creativity, with that boredom. This is the age it starts to get a little bit harder because there's generally a little bit more social and peer pressure to use it. But hopefully, if you've kind of been doing it all throughout, it should naturally just kind of keep coming to balance everything that they're doing on technology with everything they can do when they're offline too. Middle school is a really great age to start instilling some personal responsibility with technology. So maybe in elementary school, you actually took the child's phone at night. Middle school, you can start saying, hey, can you bring your phone to me? And start to put a little bit more responsibility on them to monitor their own tech, to be responsible with it. It's also a really good age to start introducing these concepts of digital citizenship and digital literacy. We're going to talk about these just a little bit. And truthfully, you can start introducing these in elementary school as well, as long as it's all kind of age appropriate. And in some educational settings, this is offered to some extent as well. Providing empathy to your youth is also really important because, again, it just goes back to this idea that they might be feeling really left out. If you have certain boundaries that say, I actually really don't want you to play Fortnite, I don't think Fortnite's really good for you, but they go to class and all their classmates are just talking about this new Fortnite, what Fortnite's doing and their character and this new season, they themselves are probably going to be experiencing this fear of missing out. And they want to be with their peers. They want to do what their peers are doing. So it's important to have some of these conversations of like, yeah, it is kind of hard to be different. And, you know, this just goes back to this is how we do things because we want you to be a successful adult as well. It's a good age to explore starting to allow your child to begin having their own device fully. Like most kids start asking for a smartphone about this age, if not younger. And really just starting to emphasize if you're going to use it as a tool. So again, in this picture, you can see all these people are using it to take pictures of notes. They're using it as a good tool. It's not a bad thing. Some examples might be, there's a company called Gabb Wireless, Gabb, and Gabb Wireless sells themselves as like being the first good phone because it looks just like a smartphone. It doesn't look like a flip phone because I've had some negative feedback from youth I've worked with that if they bring a flip phone, they kind of get picked on because it's so dumb and nobody has it and it's not cool. So Gabb Wireless worked around that. They made a smartphone. But the cool thing I like about it, it has no ability to connect to the internet. Like fundamentally, the pieces in the phone that connect to the internet are not there. So they can text, they can take pictures, but they can't send pictures. And they can really use it as a tool. They can, you know, put alarms on it. They can schedule things on it. They can use it as a timer. So the reason I like recommending that, or even, you know, one of the kind of dumber flip phones is because most parents get in a tricky situation when they just give their kid a full-blown pocket computer. Even if you put monitoring things on it, even if you try to put boundaries, by and large, the kinds of things they can get access to with a full-blown smartphone are just hard. And their brains are just not developed enough yet to know what is healthy and what is safe for them. So you can help them out at this age by making sure the first phone that they're going to get, if it's, you know, a very first tablet, that you emphasize use as a tool and that you put some structure around it and maybe just take away some of the ability to get in as much trouble with it as we see some kids doing. One of the ways that you can do this is through various monitoring and limiting programs. If you need some specific names, go ahead and throw a question in the chat box, or you're welcome to email myself or Amy or Jason after the presentation. Some suggestions are go to your internet provider, because most internet providers have programs available for limiting. They just don't tell you about them really well. I've learned through a pretty cool one through Verizon, where you pay either an additional $5 or $10 a month, and then you can start looking at where your child's been and how they've been using their phone and how much time they've been spending on stuff. So doing some work and kind of, again, talk with your family, work with your plan, see what's going to matter for you, for your individual lifestyle. And if monitoring and limiting programs are part of that, then build it in and talk to your child about why you're using it. And offer the opportunity that, you know, in the future, you might take that away and they might not have to be monitored anymore. But at this age, when they're starting to use it, you want to make sure they're using it correctly. And this is just part of how it's going to be. And then when we look into, come on, slide. There we go. When we look into high schoolers and the tech use kind of 15 through 18, again, it's kind of going to build on everything we've talked about. Continuing to really emphasize technology as a tool, continuing to have the discussions about your personal responsibility, how they're appearing as good citizens online, digital citizens, how they're using digital literacy to question if the things they're seeing online, like their fellow peers eating Tide Pods, are really healthy for them or not healthy for them. Continue to use the Tech Boundaries document, and again, make some of those age-appropriate updates. Like, for example, did your high schooler get a job? And if that's the case, are they actually maybe going to need to download an app on their smartphone so they can log in and out for work? I don't know. Every family is going to be different. High school and potentially even middle school or a little bit younger is also a really good time, as much as you are comfortable and as much as it matters for the values that you and your family maintain, to open some conversations about porn. Because chances are pretty good that at this age, if not younger, your child has been exposed to porn. I worked with a youth who told me his first exposure to porn was actually with a school iPad that was supposed to have parental controls on it. However, he had a pop-up for a topless Russian mail order bride. So of course, because he was 13, he was curious and he clicked it and he discovered porn. So we could spend an entire training on porn and how it creates really unrealistic models for healthy romantic relationships. But we are seeing some pretty chronic challenges among high schoolers and emerging young adults of how they have romantic relationships, because the idea of courtship, of dating, is honestly kind of going away. And there's this really big push to just engage sexually. And most of that comes from porn and how porn is creating the example for relationships these days. So that would just be another thing to consider when they're kind of in high school. Really leaning on the idea in high school, my house, my rules, because this tends to be the age that they're doing a whole lot of boundary pushing, because that's just developmentally normal for their brain. But using that phrase, like, this is my house, my rules. Well, you live here, this is how we're gonna do technology. Continue to have a lot of empathy for this fear of missing out. Part of the reason this Tide Pod craze got so huge was the intense foaming you would get around your mouth that made really good videos for YouTube. So you don't need to be part of that. It's not really healthy for you. And it is okay to be different from your peers. And it's okay to have this fear of missing out. Be willing to really kind of hold boundaries when needed and have those discussions about the peer pressure that your child might be feeling by what everybody else might or might not be doing online. High school is also a really good age to keep building on the personal responsibilities around tech, like lessening or even getting rid of the monitoring, encouraging them to take over the monitoring themselves, and ultimately just really being willing to let go once they're 18, because as soon as your child turns 18, they're considered an adult and you no longer get to control however they're going to use technology, with the exception that if they're living in your house, they still got to follow your rules. And that can be kind of challenging for some parents to see or to know that your child is going to use technology in a way that you don't like, but you just got to be willing to let go, because The hope is if you've kind of structured their life from birth until now, being very mindful of how you use technology and asking why and balancing it out with everything else, then they hopefully will be able to be successful with technology for the rest of their life. So that's kind of like perfect world situation. At this point, you're probably asking, well, what if I haven't done any of it? Is it going to be too late? Have I messed up? Because there's series and series of videos on the internet like this one where parents are destroying kids' electronics because they're so frustrated and they're so fed up with how much technology has kind of taken over their child's life. I want to tell you right now, don't worry, it is definitely not too late. You can take some control back in your house. You can put some more boundaries around technology, and it is always okay to go to your kid and say, I didn't know enough, I know better now, and our house, our rules, this is how it's going to be. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the mentality that you can kind of have to help you monitor and take a little bit more control back for technology in your house, and just continue to have that conversation about how do we balance technology in our house with all the other things that we like to do. So I feel a little bit like a broken record, so hopefully this is kind of landing. My house, my rules, my Wi-Fi. Ask yourself, who is paying for their cell phone bill? Who is paying for their Wi-Fi? If the answer is you, then you're the one that gets to call the shots. We worked with a youth at our center whose dad was a very highly well-respected neurosurgeon. He was very used to giving everybody orders, but every single time his child would get on the phone to talk to him, his child would just start screaming to the point that we actually had to limit his phone privileges because of how abusive he would be to his dad. And my supervisor finally had to go to him and say, would you ever let your staff talk to you like this? And he went, no, of course not. And she said, well, why are you letting your child talk to you like this then? Because that's not going to set him up to be a successful adult. And for him, that was a conversation that ended up being pretty eye-opening and allowed him to start creating some stronger boundaries within his house and get some control back when he felt like technology had really taken over his child and he no longer had a say. So just don't be afraid to really set some hard rules if you need it, and acknowledge I may have messed up at some point. I didn't know enough, but I know better now, and in our house, this is how we're going to interact with technology. Another way that you can kind of think about this as a parent is ask yourself, what is my responsibility? So there's 3 ways that we can kind of do this. You can think of 3 levels. So the first level is like a child who just exists within your house. As a parent, your responsibility is really only to make sure they get food, water, shelter, and safety. Legally, those are your obligations. So if your child is not going to participate, if your child's not going to go along with things like chores, household rules, then they're just kind of existing in your house. The next level up would be a child who participates. So, maybe they do some chores, but you have to really bug them about it. Maybe they do some stuff with family, but they just go, oh, it's boring. Any of those kind of stuff, they're going to get obviously all the things the same child who exists, but they're also going to get, maybe you give them access to internet. Maybe you give them rides to the friends. Maybe you give them an allowance. Again, this is where it starts to get kind of individualized. And then the third level we can think is like, this is a child who contributes. So maybe this is a kid that says, hey, I'll do the dishes tonight. Or, which I know that's not realistic. No kid says that. But, the idea is you don't have to bug them as much. You don't have to ask them as much. They offer, hey, let's go do this as a family. That's a child who's going to get all of these plus maybe their own devices. Maybe as a family, you start giving them access and funding to the sports, extracurricular activities. Maybe they get some increased freedoms, like going online unsupervised. Because every single family is different, maybe some of these get swapped. A child who participates gets their own device, where a child who's contributing gets an allowance. This is just another way that you as a parent can kind of think about, what's my responsibility for my kid? Because truthfully, you give a lot to your child that often they're not aware of, like rides to their friends' houses. And just asking yourself, at what level do I need to be responsible to you? And what are you going to do as a member of our household to help make this smoother and better for everybody within the house? This statement, be a pioneer, we would talk to the families that we would work with through Restart about being willing to be a pioneer all the time. And the reason we would use the phrase be a pioneer is because in the Old West times, everybody kind of thought the people who were loading up their covered wagons and going west was pretty crazy and pretty different, and probably not going to be very successful. However, I would be willing to guess that just about every single one of us sitting here in this presentation had some connection to the people who were brave and willing to be coming out west. So in order to manage technology in the society we live in today, that really drives us for more and more technology. If you think back to that Facebook slide we started with, you have to be willing to be a pioneer and just set yourself aside and know that you are probably going to be going against some conventions with whatever boundaries you create. But that's okay, because that's what might be necessary for you and your house and your family. Another thing that we would use that helped parents quite a bit is this idea of working out of your rational or reasonable and your wise mind, not your emotional mind. And the reason I say this is because I would often work with families who had gotten to the point where they felt like they were basically just playing whack-a-mole with technology and their kid. They would take a phone away, their kid would find a phone at school. They would limit the internet at night, their kid would sneak out and go to a gaming cafe. And ultimately, this created this cycle of fear and anxiety. And so they started to create boundaries and structure out of a basis of anger, feelings, stress. And it just wasn't super sustainable. And it usually ended up in a lot of fighting at home. So we would encourage families to kind of set that aside and instead go and use your reasonable mind, which relies on logic, on research, on your experiences. And the wise mind's a bit of both, where, you acknowledge, I have this feeling, I'm worried about how you're going to be using technology. So because I am worried, I am going to put this boundary in place. That very, slide we were talking about with asking why. Why am I allowing my child to watch a movie right now? Because I'm emotionally tired and it's what's healthiest for me. That is still okay, but that is a decision that is being made out of your reasonable and your wise mind, not your emotional mind that just kind of says, oh, I'm tired, just do it. And it's a different way of parenting, but what we would find is a lot of parents who are willing to work out of those, the reasonable and the wise mind, were a lot more successful with their technology boundaries, because it was not as much a game of whack-a-mole. It was leaning on the structures that they had created already and saying, well, I'm sorry, that's just how it is. Cuts out so much power struggle if you can do it like that. The biggest recommendation we would make to families when it comes to reining technology back in, or even just starting to use technology sustainably within the house, is boundaries. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. We hear this all the time. So I learned in working with a lot of the tech families that I did that I had to be more specific. It wasn't just creating a boundary. It was setting a boundary, holding the boundary, and maintaining the boundary. And the reason I say this is because most parents would start with what we see here, this kind of rigid wall-like boundary. You can't use technology like this. But because they would approach it in this manner, their child would often learn to just bug and bug, and then that boundary would slowly just kind of create down to here, to this limited or non-existent boundary, because their parent was just so over being asked. I'm tired of it. I don't even want to hear it anymore. I'm tired of the fight. It's not worth it. It's too much of an argument. Just do it. So what we would have to help parents do is come back to setting a boundary, holding it, and then maintaining it. So every single time your child asks, go back to that document you've created. This is the thing I love about creating a tech document, is it takes a lot of the guesswork out, because the way you write it creates it to be healthy boundaries for yourself and for your family and for your child. Healthy boundaries are going to look like, maybe sometimes I might make an exception, but by and large, we are all going to do it like this, period. And if you write it down in a document, there's no guesswork. It's just, it is or it isn't. And it becomes much easier to parent out of that rational, thoughtful kind of place. And it just makes it a lot easier for everybody. But the willingness to hold and maintain boundaries, not just set them, really helped a lot of families be more successful in the long term with technology too. When I was working for Restart Life, one of the first things we would do is we would use a pizza model to help families explore if they did need to rebalance tech. So what we would have them do is we would have them draw a pizza. I wasn't able to find a great picture of this online, but I did find another way that you can do this that essentially has 8 different, we'll call them slices. And those slices are going to represent different areas of your life. So the example here has like health, hobbies, which would fit for technology, like finances, family, spirituality, community, friends, and work. So these are all different areas that we put energy into in our life. So what we would encourage families to do is take a moment, draw this out for your family. So for some families, some of these things may be more important than others. And whatever 8 things you want to put on the outside is fine. It's just the top 8 things that you find yourself and your family doing the most. And then draw the slices in. So the kids that I worked with would often tell me that this slice for tech or hobbies had essentially eaten over the rest. And it was maybe like 6 or 7 slices of the pizza. And then we would talk about, okay, well, but then what you're looking at is you have left a slice and a half or 2 for everything else in your life, for your family, for your schoolwork, for your personal health. And realistically, you can't do much with a teeny tiny slice. Nobody likes a teeny tiny slice of pizza. Everybody likes a solid slice of pizza. So we would ask families, what did it need to look like to balance your pizza back out? No, I don't think anybody is ever going to have perfectly even pizzas. That just isn't realistic. But it is realistic to ask that each slice is somewhat equal, so that the amount of time that you are putting into your hobbies is not taking over the amount of time that you're spending with your friends, your family, or work or schoolwork. And ultimately asking yourself, what is your own use like? Because I can think of 2 youth I worked with. The first youth I worked with, their family was very dedicated to making a tech change, and they ended up needing to make a tech change across the entire family. So every single family member changed how they used technology. Luckily, I'm actually to still be in contact with this youth, and he's doing awesome. His family is doing really well, and they really credit being willing to make some changes with their whole family as a large part of why that's happening. The other youth that I can think of, the family was pretty tech heavy. They had Alexas and various devices in almost every room, and they really didn't want to make tech use changes as a family, but they did expect that the youth who had come through our program to maintain the changes that he had made while he was with us. Unfortunately, I got contacted by that family about a year afterwards saying, we need help. It's just not working. He wants to really start playing video games again. And, so luckily I was able to work with him a little bit, but fundamentally one of the things I saw was that because this youth's younger brother, parents, other family members were still deeply involved in technology, it was super hard for him to make changes that stick with his own use, because it's essentially like asking somebody who is struggling with like an alcohol addiction to just be like, well, just come to family Christmas, there'll be some beers, but you don't have to drink them. That's still pretty triggering for the way your brain works. And it can be really hard, especially when somebody is younger and their brain's just not developed enough yet to have that kind of self-control. So really sitting down and being honest and asking yourself, what changes are you willing to make as a whole family, can really be a hard conversation, but it can be a very important conversation to have as well. So let's talk for a second about digital citizenship. So I have found this a really helpful way to frame how I talk to youth about engaging with anything I'm doing online, whether that's talking with people, shopping, watching YouTube, playing video games, it doesn't matter. We are generally taught to be good citizens within this country. And what does that look like? Well, it looks like you follow laws. It looks like maybe you vote, whatever that's going to be for each person. We talk about your reputation. The challenge that we run into is a lot of these conversations don't cross over that internet boundary and what we do online. So the concept of digital citizen essentially takes a lot of what you're being taught to be a good citizen in this country and applies it to what you do online. So examples would be like digital access, like who is getting access to technology? Is it fair? Is it equitable across the board? Digital commerce, when you're buying and selling goods online, how do you do this in a way that is safe, respectful? Digital communication, what is or is not okay to put and say online? There was a case, I believe it was last year, of a youth that actually got accepted and then denied to go to, I think it was either Harvard or Yale, because when they started to look into his Facebook, it wasn't even him, but his friends had been making some inflammatory comments. The school got really concerned and they told him they didn't want him to attend. Now, luckily, he was able to work it out so that he did get to attend the school. But in this case, that digital communication piece was really important because it was what his friends had been putting on his Facebook that caused him to have challenges in his life. So this is a really important one for how to be successful. Digital literacy is a huge one. We'll actually spend the next slide talking about that. Digital etiquette, like what is and isn't okay to do online, thinking about your reputation, thinking about what is going to matter, even if it's online, not offline. Digital law, this is a really important one. Most children don't realize that technically you legally still have to be 18 to watch porn. And I've had some really interesting reactions when I tell kids this. And most porn sites are not doing a good job anymore of stopping kids. They just have the fine print at the bottom. But there have been more than one youth who have gotten caught up in some sort of legal challenges because they didn't understand digital law. Fits into this next one of digital rights and responsibilities. What are your rights and responsibilities online? Digital health and wellness. So how do I balance my physical and my psychological well-being while engaging with things online? And then very important as well, digital security. How do I do things to keep myself safe online beyond just don't tell people my name, don't take my personal information out? So citizenship and digital citizenship can be really, really helpful frameworks for you as parents to have some of these conversations with your kids. And if you would like some specific resources on digital citizenships, again, just throw a question in the chat box or email us after the presentation, and I'd be happy to get you some more direct ways that you can learn more and you can talk more about digital citizenship. Even just a quick Google search, you tend to find a fair amount of things too. So digital literacy is one of the most important things we can teach our children as well. Digital literacy is essentially this idea of using the internet in a way that challenges some critical thinking, is safe. So if I'm on Facebook and somebody just posts an article, instead of taking it at face value, because of digital literacy, I know to look at things at like, well, what date was this posted? This article is actually like 4 years out of date. So it might be like really cool headline, but it actually doesn't matter anymore as much. Or asking yourself, well, where is this coming from? Cite my sources. Digital literacy can be a pretty important thing to teach our children. And similar to the slide before, if you would like more information on digital literacy, let me know, and I can get that over to you as well. So we said we would give an example of a media plan. Healthychildren.org is the website. And they have offered a really awesome, really easy way to create a media plan for your family. You can get this in English or in Spanish. So if you enter your family name, let's say we're the Smiths, and my child's name is Joe, and Joe, we'll say, is in elementary school. I can add other children in this as well. What's going to start happening is it's going to talk to me about how I can customize this plan for my family and how I can customize it for each child within my family. So a challenge that I've gotten feedback or I've seen happen before is you have a youth who's in like late middle school, maybe high school, but then you also have another kid that's in kindergarten. Those are really different ages to try to balance and manage technology. And the reason I really like using this as a structure to create this plan is because it can account for the different ages on those kids as well. So what it's going to do is it's going to go through all the different screen-free zones you want for Joe in your house. Is that going to be the bedroom? Is that going to be the kitchen? Is this going to be the car? or maybe I worked with one family, and the way that they had it is that the upstairs, where all the bedrooms were and everything, was the tech-free zone. Their children were not allowed to bring their phones upstairs, but the downstairs and the basement was fair game, totally allowed to be played. It's going to go through some screen-free times. So here's that one while in the car. And you can just check the boxes for the ones you want while at school, while doing your homework. Family time, meal times, an hour before bed is generally the common recommendation. I know this isn't always practical, but sleep and technology is highly related. So if your child is having a hard time sleeping, try to just limit an hour before bed and see what happens. Putting some curfews on the device is another really good way. They'll charge overnight where. Talking about choosing and diversifying your media can be really important too. So this was going back to what I was talking about, those like educational or interactive kind of engaging would be one way that you can think about diversifying your media. So here we're going to say when we have recreational screen time, we're going to co-watch, co-play. And that's actually one of the best things you can do as a parent, to kind of put yourself in your child's shoes. Say, hey, show me Fortnite, show me your character. How are you playing this? Can you teach me how to do it? I'll speak for myself. I have 0 video game skills. So when the kids ask me to play video games with them, I will be transparent. I'm probably going to do a really bad job, but I love watching you play because they're invested in it. They're curious about it. We're also going to go through when we have recreational or fun screen time, we're going to do what? So it'll check, and again, this goes through both at your home, at somebody else's home. We're going to talk about balancing online and offline time. So by decreasing screen time, we're going to have more time for what? Playing board games, being creative, doing art, doing some sort of, singing, theater. And I do acknowledge that right now in the age of COVID, other tech-related things are really pretty hard to access. So that's why I go back to my fundamental balance tech time with nature time. Because nature is one of the few things that we are definitely still encouraged to engage with during COVID. It's okay. It's considered really good for us. There's tons of research about how it really helps us to spend time in nature. So this is a really good way to balance. This plan talks about media manners. So what are some good media manners we could do? This also talks about digital citizenship a little bit, and we'll be good digital citizens by doing what? Talking about safety first, talking about sleep and exercise, and then you can print this whole thing out and you can post it somewhere and everybody can see it. It can very much become a living document because you can create your own login here on the site. And then every time you need to come update your plan, you don't have to do a whole new one. You can just kind of adjust as needed. The other reason I really like this website is it has right over here a media time calculator. So if we know Joe needs to spend maybe two hours a week on his after school activity, needs to spend an hour and a half on his chores, we're going to go ahead and spend like 5+ hours of family time per week. You can see how just calculating this out is starting to cut into this screen time. So you can go through as a family and you can kind of say how much time is reasonable for each one of your children to do these things. And then, the sleep will be built into this calculator as what is the current recommendation for amount of sleep for your child's age. But if you can sit here and fill this out, give it some really mindful thought. Like, do you need to spend an hour on meal times? Is that a 2-hour thing? Is that a half-hour thing? Each family is going to be different. But if you sit down and do this, it will leave you with as much screen time as your kids should have each day or each week. And just, again, just to kind of emphasize, I really like this quote from Tom Clancy. He says, look, technology is another word for tool. There was a time when nails were high tech. There was a time when people had to be told how to use a telephone. We got past that. Technology is just a tool, and people use tools to improve their lives. And the reason I bring this up is because there's a lot of ways that our children can use technology that will help them be successful, that will help them be great and wonderful and very, very good in this world. But it comes back to us and how we model technology, how we're willing to balance technology with the other things available in our life. And if we're really just willing to understand that technology is a tool, and how we're going to use it is really going to determine the risks and the benefits to what we're going to get out of it. So I think we're doing okay on time, and we can probably move into a question portion. And I'll just leave this slide up so you can have our various different emails in here as well.
Thank you, Brenda. That was so wonderful. We, at this point, don't have any questions in the chat box. So if there's anybody who is thinking of something here and you want to jump in, you can write it in the text box. You're welcome to just put your microphone on too and share if you have a question. Just give it a few minutes.
So I'm looking, I know I did get one question through my email from somebody who was not able to attend today, but was still interested in coming.
We did get a question coming through from Jeanette.
Oh, sure.
She says, you mentioned programs for smartphones. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, so smartphones are a really tricky area where you can have some monitoring. I think one of the most challenging things that I saw in my work with youth was that the kids become far more tech savvy than the parents. So parent would put some sort of monitoring software in the computer, kid would learn how to get around it and just do it on their phone. Parent would not be able to apply same style of monitoring software to the phone they did the computer. So this is why it goes back to really being mindful of, why are you giving your child their first phone? Is their first phone a full smartphone, or is there a way you could get them a dumb phone, a track phone, the Gab wireless, so that they can start using a phone, but they don't get the full range of everything that you get? I do know I had one family that decided to get their child an iPhone, so they took their iPhone to an Apple store, and they just asked the people at the Apple store to help put some blocks so that they couldn't get the full range of everything on the iPhone. I would commonly get asked, well, but what age do I give my child a phone? It's such a hard one to answer because there's no cut and dry thing. Like maybe you have an 8-year-old that's starting to do like sports or take classes, and you have other children and you want to be able to have them call you when they're done and say, hey, I need to be picked up. But that can be pretty well done with just like a dumb phone. But then you also might have, like a teenager that really wants a whole phone and they start working. So typically for a lot of parents, I would recommend tying in the age that they get a full-blown smartphone with work. So as soon as you can get a job, I will give you a smartphone. And that job doesn't necessarily have to be a full on the books kind of job. Maybe they're starting to babysit. Maybe they're mowing lawns. Maybe they're, bucking bales for somebody somewhere. That's work though. And because you are willing to put work in, that tells me that you are responsible enough to start having your own phone. I'm not sure if that completely answered your question, but those are generally some of the things I would talk to families about when it comes to smartphones.
A question.
I was going to throw one out there.
Oh, go ahead, Jason.
Questions we got earlier, just from parents that had emailed earlier. I was just going to read that one for you, Brenda.
Oh, yes, please. That'd be great.
With parents having to work to make ends meet and not having consistent childcare, with the way school is, my child and I have turned to screen time for babysitting. This isn't the norm, and we don't necessarily like it, but we don't see it changing anytime soon. So instead of video games and movies all day, what sites, shows do you recommend that are free, fun, and educational?
Sure. Great question. So again, I'm going to go back to PBS. This is actually kind of like a silver lining for COVID, is that right now a number of aquariums, museums, art museums, zoos have created like virtual walkthroughs. So if you have always wanted to explore the Monterey Bay Aquarium, but there's probably no way that you've ever going to be able to get out to Monterey, California and go see it, you and your child can spend some time walking through the aquarium and actually see what it's like and learn about what's offered there. Ask your child, is there ever anything you've wanted to cook, you've wanted to bake, you've wanted to do art about? Well, let's see if we can watch a YouTube video that shows us how to do that and then try to do it ourselves. So again, it's a little more work for you as a parent, but it's also encouraging your child to learn more about the world, to get creative, to be imaginative, and all these things that, yes, you are going to be using technology, but it's a little step above just kind of, recreationally watching a movie for fun.
I was also just going to jump in there. Oh, we got another question who came in. I'll save my question for later.
Okay.
As this is from Chris. As parents, we model limited tech use and restrict tech time to a pretty minimal amount. Yet our 10-year-old son acts obsessed with screen time. I struggle often because I feel like we are denying a part of who he is and what he loves. How do I balance honoring his passion with my minimal tech time expectations?
Ooh, great question. Harder to answer though, because there's a lot of kids out there that are going to tell you, I want to be a professional gamer. I want to be a professional YouTuber. And this is in a lot of ways where we're seeing the field trend. So in some respects, it's definitely not bad that your kid has a really large technology interest. So this is where kind of partnering with your kid can be a really cool way to balance, because you can say, well, you kind of have learned where I'm coming from. Can you show me what you're doing? Who are you watching on YouTube? What have you been making? What have you been creating? How are you playing these video games? Get really curious about what your kid's doing online. One of the funnest things that I got to do actually is I would have long conversations with the kids I worked with about, especially their video game characters. I would ask them, are you like a good character or a bad character? What kind of clothes do you wear? Like, I have a youth who told me they like to play a medic character, kind of a doctor, helping character. So then we were able to foster some really cool conversations from that of like, well, how can we take what you really love about doing online and do it offline? Or how can we acknowledge you're pretty skilled at this? Like, yeah, you're going to be a really great graphic designer someday, but that means you got to like draw just as much as you're being online. So it goes back to that emphasis on balance and what boundaries you have put in your home. And maybe for a kid like this, that the motivation is a lot of tech time. So it's like, great, you've earned more tech time because you spent some time in nature. A lot of times the kids I worked with that really have their heart set on some sort of technology career generally didn't spend a whole lot of time outside, didn't see the benefit in it, didn't like it, said it was boring, it sucks, I don't want to do it. When we would really just give them education about, well, this is what it does to your brain, this is why it really benefits you to be outside, this is why balance is really important, this is how I see it impacting our family relationships, and consistently message a lot of that, most of the time the kids I worked with were willing to have more balance in their life because they went, wow, I didn't actually realize it did that to my brain. Or, I don't actually want to have poor eyesight and carpal tunnel and, a lot of things we see that come from being really sedentary and spending time in front of a screen. And truthfully, most like professional video gamers that you talk to, they don't like their job because they have to spend upwards of like 12 plus hours on the game every day. They generally have to spend money. just to maintain their status and be successful. The other thing is that they don't get to play different kinds of games. They typically play one game, and it gets boring to play one game after a while. And so, again, just balancing out the sensationalism of a hardcore career in tech, which is not bad, and it can be really successful for some kids, with what are the other things that make your life whole and fulfilling. And, encourage them to find at least one hobby or one tech thing offline after you've given them a fair amount of information about the impacts of technology. And, maybe try to connect them with some people that actually work in technology so they can ask questions and they can get a little bit more of a realistic understanding of what a job in technology
You're getting water all over out here.
might look like.
I'm going to jump in with a question I've asked you before, Brenda, but maybe other parents would get something out of this. I asked Brenda, because my kids are younger, they're 4 and 6, and so I was asking about gateways, like what are like the gateway things that I need to watch out for as a parent? And
Yeah.
Brenda, you share your answer.
Yeah, that's another good question, and that's where it gets kind of hard, because when I think about a lot of the kids I worked with through Restart, I would say their gateways were early and large amounts of unmonitored video game usage. So, they got an Xbox for themselves that they could put in their own room with their own TV when they were 6, and then on one hand, it was easy for their parent because they never left their room. But on the other hand, it can be really challenging for a kid because then they have this just masterful giant thing that connects you with everything on the internet. And you can play these games for hours and hours. And it's just not really well monitored. So that would be one. Another one would be early smartphone, unmonitored, no boundaries kind of smartphone usage. Where, maybe a child got their first smartphone in 5th grade. And again, there was just not much monitoring on it. I actually had one youth who told me the very, very first thing he ever wanted to do as soon as he got his first smartphone, because he had been listening to all of his older friends talk about it, was watch porn. So his parents gave him his smartphone. Luckily, they had put some boundaries on it. So he goes to his room. He tries to look up porn. It doesn't work. But if they hadn't have done that, this would have been a kid where, I think he was like 14 at the time, would have gotten access to this giant wide world of things that he just doesn't really quite understand. And then the last, and I almost hate to bring this one up because there can be so much good use of technology in schools. But by and large, a lot of the youth I worked with, and to be clear, I worked with youth from across the nation that generally came from more affluent homes and affluent communities. But most of them told me that some of the first problems that they started getting into with technology were with their school-issued iPad or computer. Now, I know most of these devices are typically supposed to have some pretty strong limiting software, monitoring things, so that they couldn't just go anywhere on the internet. But this goes back to where a lot of the kids these days are far more tech savvy than the adults they interact with. They understand coding. They understand how to get around systems. So by and large, most of the kids that I worked with would not use their school-issued technology in a really appropriate manner, but they would be doing it in such a way that it'd be flying under the radar. So everything in the home would be getting taken away. But because you need to do school and because you have the school-issued laptop, we're still going to let you have access to that. And the problem is they would go to their room and they'd say, oh, well, I'm doing homework. And the parents would go, oh, okay, you're probably doing homework. When the reality is they actually had pretty much hacked the device to be able to do whatever they wanted to do online, play their video games, things like that. So the best fix to that was just to have parents actually sit with them or try to be given as much of their schoolwork in just a pen and paper format.
Brenda, when I asked you that question in the past, your simple response was the device.
Yeah.
That the device is the
The
gateway.
device.
And that was kind of eye-opening for me.
Mm-hmm.
That piece of it too. So we're getting right up to 7 o'clock. Thank you for the great questions. Any last minute questions, comments?
I've got one, Brenda, since we got you here.
Yeah.
I work a lot with different families, and I know every family can be, different with how they approach technology. But I'm curious, like, are there any absolutes? Are there any boundaries that we know are absolutely bad for kids at different ages when it comes to maybe, the age to give a kid a phone, or screen time for younger kids, or if a kid's really passionate about technology, we don't want so much time spent with it. I'm just kind of curious if we have that absolute, or if it's still kind of in this gray area of unknown when we go forward.
Yeah. So because it is such a new and emerging problem, we're finally just, I think, starting to get to the point with, things like the movie The Social Dilemma coming out, with it becoming a little bit more well known that most of the large tech giants, who like Mark Zuckerberg, the people who run Twitter, Instagram, those sorts of things, don't even allow their own children to use these platforms. That kind of basis of knowledge, I think, is getting out a little bit more into the general society. And so people are starting to become more aware of it. But because we have been using technology so much more intently for much longer than we've been aware of the potential pitfalls or challenges with it, truthfully, there is not one hard and fast that says, well, at this age you can give this kid this, and at this age you can give this kid this. Typically, the general recommendations right now are to limit your child to no more than about 2 to 2.5 hours of screen time each day, which actually is pretty low. And truthfully, I don't think most people hit that. I know I don't even hit that because of how much I use my computer for work. But those are the recommendations out right now. Typically, the recommendations are running that you do not get your child their first smartphone until they are at least 16, just because their brain has a little bit longer to develop some self-control and some of those critical thinking skills of like, why am I using this? How is it good for me to use this safely? The one hard and fast I think I will throw out there, just because of how much I had to treat porn addictions, is just don't let your kid get access to it. And I know it's so much easier said than done, because they might be hanging out with their friends. Their friend pulls out a smartphone, says, hey, watch this. But by and large, I had a lot more challenges with youth that got access to their own device and then started watching porn at a very young age. And when I say very young, I mean as early as like 3rd grade. Unfortunately, we might even have adults that are watching it and the child's just in the room. But, one of the easiest analogies I've ever heard is if you think about, like, when you watch an action movie, you might get into it, but, when I watch Transformers, I don't then go walk down the street and think that every car is going to turn into this giant robot and all this exciting stuff is going to happen. I know it's a movie and it's not real life. You can think of porn as the same way. It is a movie. It has been structured to create this sense of something, but it is no way a realistic example of a healthy, intimate relationship in today's world. So hopefully that kind of answered your question, Jason.
All right, so it's just exactly 7 o'clock right now. Thank you so much, Brenda, for sharing your deep knowledge on this subject with us. We're so appreciative.
You're welcome.
Thank you for those of you who joined us tonight and for your thoughtful questions. We are recording this presentation, and we haven't figured out where we're going to post it so that other parents can access it yet, but we will get that information out to you when we have it figured out.
And please do fill out our survey that we have here in the chat box, because if you got some benefit out of this presentation, I would definitely love to do further presentations, maybe some age-specific ones, or if you have some deeper specific questions about how do I promote technology in my home with my child in a way that's safe and sustainable, then please go ahead and fill out that survey, because we're going to use that to help generate interest and decide what other further offerings we can give for you guys about technology.
And for the survey, what you'll need to do is just copy that link and then paste it into your browser. And on the survey, there's an option, if you would like to, you can put your email address in there. It's just for, you know, our group here, and we could send you some of the resources that Brenda has that you might benefit from as well. So let me give you all a second to copy that and get it into your browser before we shut out. And thank you so much. Thank you, Jason and Brenda, and also John. And Rebecca Lockridge is joining us tonight too. She's our parent liaison at Washington and Winans.